The fourth speaker at the 2018 La Trobe Business School Innovation in Food and Agribusiness Forum is Andrea Koch, Principal of Agtech Proprietary Limited and Adjunct Associate Professor at the University of Sydney's Institute of Agriculture. The title of Andrea's presentation is Crossing the Chasm. Now, Andrea gives a very insightful and comprehensive overview of Agtech revolution currently underway and of the innovation and production possibilities that the food and agribusiness sector have embraced. She reminds us that the digital transformation of the global economy, which is driven by the Internet of Things, has seen a proliferation of connected possibilities, from 500 million connections not so long ago to a predicted 50 billion by 2020. Andrea raises important questions and problems associated with clarifying data ownership, as an aside in the presentation, but notes that open data sharing remains a central concern for many in the Australian agricultural sector. Andrea explains the current divide between what she describes as the rural world and the urban world. On the one side of the divide are the users of farm technology, that is the farmers and the ecosystem of rural suppliers, advisors and consultants. On the other side are the investors and finance community, tech developers and urban-based researchers and institutions, and the agri-politics groups. Now, these worlds are somewhat disconnected, and this needs to change, according to Andrea. This requires new research funding models, and while Andrea suggests there are great examples in the US and the Netherlands, she argues Australia needs to grow its own agricultural innovation system to bridge the current chasm. So please enjoy Andrea's very insightful presentation.
I have my own consultancy business in agricultural technology, which draws on my great passion for agriculture and science. I grew up on a farm in South Australia. I'm fifth generation, so I have it in my DNA. It also draws on 15 years of product development experience in technology-related industries, telecoms, internet, technology, and my deep experience and knowledge in marketing strategy and building businesses. I'm also on the board of the National Farmers Federation and Sproutex, and I'll refer to both those organisations as I go through. Back in 1999, which is almost 20 years ago, and I know that intimately because my son was born that year, this man articulated a concept which is going to change the world and is changing the world. He envisaged a system whereby every aspect of our world physically is connected to the internet through sensing technology, through actuators. And that these computers would be out there everywhere, connected to everything, measuring, monitoring, collecting data, and through the analysis of that data would be then improving the productivity and the efficiency of the way our lives are run. The man's name is Kevin Ashton. He's a British technological pioneer, and he coined the term the Internet of Things. And I'm here to tell you today that we're in the transition now from the old analogue world, which is the only world we've ever known, into a new digital world, which completely changes everything. It changes the way that we live our lives, the way we work, the way that we play, and all of those sorts of things. And the utopian vision for the Internet of Things is that every aspect of our physical world is connected to this internet, and that it all runs behind the scenes in the background, and that we live our lives in and around it. And more recently, I've just taken this quote because more recently he's kind of described where we are in this journey. And he says, in the 20th century, computers were brains without sensors. They only knew what we told them. This was a huge limitation. There is many billion times more information in the world than people could possibly type in through a keyboard or scan with a barcode. In the 21st century, because of the Internet of Things, computers can sense things for themselves. It's only been a few years, but we already take network sensors for granted, and that's so true. One example is GPS-based location sensing. Civilian GPS was first authorised by Congress in 2000, and the GPS systems in cell phones were not tested until 2004. Yet, it's already hard to imagine a world without GPS. It helps us find our way around. In the imminent future, it will enable things like self-driving cars, which will give us back the 20 days a year that we spend doing nothing but driving, will save 40,000 lives a year in the US alone, will reduce traffic and pollution, and will allow cities to grow without devoting as much land to roads. So the key thing there is that the Internet of Things can measure, monitor, translate and capture data without the impediment of human interaction into those systems and the need for human input. And so it means that we can measure complex systems in ways that we never could before. And this is happening. This is a happening thing. So in 2015, there were about 25 billion devices, or about 3 per person, per head of population in the world. Just 5 years later, the forecast is that by 2050, there'll be 50 million of these. So 7 devices, Internet of Things devices per human on the planet. And so, you know, if what the Internet of Things does is enable us to sense and to measure and to monitor complex environments, there's no more complex environment than a farm. You know, you've got the interaction between soil, plants, the atmosphere, water, climate, equipment, animals, fences, tractors, buildings, telecommunications infrastructure. So you've got all of these complex systems that have to interact. And the farmer, the producer, is managing all of these systems each and every day. And so almost in no other more complex environment will the Internet of Things disrupt the way that we do business and the way that we manage things. So of course, you know, the vision for smart farms and for the Internet of Things on farms is that we'll have big data analysis, robots, sensing technologies that transform the way that we manage these systems and produce food. And this is spawning a whole new level of activity in technology development around agriculture and food. And here are just some of the categories in which these developments are occurring. So, you know, when we think about applying the Internet of Things and all these technologies into farming systems, we tend to think about applying it into what we know. And yes, that's happening. Absolutely, that's happening. But it's also changing how we produce food. And so, you know, the food production of the future is a fusion of production, genetics, technology, and it's actually changing the way what agriculture actually means. So if we think about it in terms of how we do it now, and I've used livestock as an example, you know, we all know how livestock is managed, how it's grazed, how we deal with dairy cows and so forth. And so the obvious answer of an application of technology is, you know, this idea of Fitbit for cows. And there's an absolute plethora of devices, tracking devices, sensing devices that are being used with animals across the board to measure everything from biometrics to fertility to how food is going through their systems, what food's going through their systems, how it's being digested, what the outputs are, you know, what the side effects are, how do we manage all these things. One of the startups I saw recently had a sensing device that was in a feed, based in the feed system for the cows, that measured the cow's breath and could tell you whether it was, you know, ready to have a baby or not, so whether it was fertile or not. So incredible technology is being applied into this space. And these ones here on the, oh, sorry, I've gone trying to get my device working. These ones here on the right-hand side of the Australian, some of the Australian companies that are working in this space. But it also changes food production, as I said. So, you know, you also would have heard of this idea of cultured meat, also known as lab-grown meat or clean meat. And why is it called clean meat? Because it's produced in a laboratory in highly controlled situations without the inputs of chemicals, without all of those variables that farmers are having to manage. And there's a very clear provenance stream associated with these products. So, you know, you will have heard of the $300,000 burger that was produced in, 3D printed burger that was produced in 2013, which is now less than $10 to produce. So the prototype costs a lot, but they're now driving down the cost of those sorts of products. So basically where you input plant material, put it through a 3D printer, and out comes this burger, you know, hamburger. And there's a number of startups that are operating in this space. The guy with the cowboy hat there is Elon Musk's brother. And he's investing a lot into this whole idea of cultured meat, lab-grown meat. And it's not just beef, it's also chicken, it's also fish, it's also eggs. So all of those animal proteins are now being disrupted through this process, through these technologies. And this one here, the egg one, is a lovely example, and there's a nice little video on their website. It's called Just Egg. And the egg product there is a scrambled egg product, but it's actually being produced from mung beans. So it's this idea that we can actually go from plant to protein without going through an animal. And it kind of changes everything. It also then makes us have to think about, well, of these animals that we are producing and these animal proteins that we are producing, how do we position those with the consumer now? You know, they've got a whole new kind of level of competition to be thinking about. And they won't get knocked out, no way. But, you know, we've got to start thinking about what are the benefits that this animal product is actually bringing to a consumer and be able to articulate those things. And it's not just, you know, these traditional sources of protein we know about, it's also the alternative protein market that's growing rapidly. So protein that comes from bugs, from other plants that we haven't even thought of yet, that we can extract the protein out of. And again, on the right-hand side here, we've got two of our own Australian startups here, GoTerra, which you may have heard about, which is based in Canberra, and the Edible Bug Shop, which is one of the current cohort of SproutX startups that are going through that SproutX accelerator program. And of course, we also change the scale of agriculture. And, you know, when we think of agriculture here in Australia, we think of broadacre, big farms, outback stations, big cropping areas, horticulture, sugarcane fields. You know, that's, if you think about the different sectors that we have, we think about it on big broadacre scales. But agriculture is going vertical and it's going indoors. And just a few examples here. So Green Camel is a startup which is basically doing aquaponics at commercial scale. So they've got fish in the bottom and they're growing plants up the top. And they're supplying Coles and Woolies with greens, and they're based, they're a couple of graduates from Sydney Uni, they're based at the Camden campus. Kipster is a startup in the Netherlands which set out to produce chickens in the most sustainable, environmental and ethical way under a roof. And so they're actually the happiest chooks that I've ever seen, I think, in that picture, in a barn type situation or a shed type situation. You would have heard of Sundrop, which is based in the desert practically at Port Augusta, where they're using solar energy to desalinate seawater out of the Spencer Gulf and use that to grow tomatoes undercover, producing new forms of employment, which is great for that area. And, you know, just completely turning on its head what we can do in desert environments. And then Farmwall I've put there, I met Gert last night, and I think he's speaking today. Yeah, so have a chat with him. This Farmwall is a wonderful example of a startup that's coming through this whole Agtech innovation system. And I was one of their crowdsourcing funders. I put a little bit of money in because I wanted to help them on their journey. And so it was really great to meet him last night and have a chat with him. And, you know, this whole idea of indoor agriculture and controlled agriculture, the Dutch have really are mastering this. It's so interesting. So large swaths of the landscape in the Netherlands are covered with these indoor agricultural machines, if you like, or generating systems. And it's quite interesting what they thought about when they went into this. They weren't thinking about production, they weren't focusing on production, they were focusing on technology. And the Netherlands is actually the biggest exporter of food in the world. So in 2016-17, they exported $147 billion worth of food, and we exported $44 billion. So we're a third of that, less than a third of that. And yet you could fit the Netherlands into Australia 185 times. So, you know, we get caught up in our constraints. You know, one of their problems is that they have problems with flooding. So we have problems with drought. So they have problems with flooding. Okay, let's get over it. How do we apply technology into our landscapes across the board in new ways which actually change the way that we produce food? So what's driving all this disruption? Yes, there's this idea that we need to feed 9 billion people, we need to do it sustainably, but there's more. There's the consumer. So consumers are now demanding various types of foods, and I've given you the example of the plant-based protein already. Veganism is growing. There's an underlying ideology of animal rights which drives veganism, but there's also a version of that which is kind of plant-based diet, which is completely driven by health and health issues, and that's increasing. So as we live in an increasingly toxified world, those health issues and those chronic illnesses and so forth become a bigger and bigger issue, and so diet becomes more of a focus. And that leads into the idea of nutraceuticals, so food as medicine, and personalised nutrition. So actually personalising nutrition plans and diets and so forth based on what's going on at the cellular level in your DNA, in your body. And that's all happening now. Protein for the rising middle class, we all know about that, the growth of the middle class in India, Asia, and China and so forth. What is the source of food? We all know about the provenance story, how food is purchased and delivered. So through Alibaba, you can buy a beautiful apple that's been perfectly packaged for $20 from Tasmania or from New Zealand into China. And consumers obviously are very switched on to the idea of limiting waste. It's plus technology. I've talked about all these things already. But it's also about capital. And Agtech is actually an investment category. That's where it's come from, and that's what it is. If you want to know, what's driving this whole Agtech thing, it is money. Before the Agtech boom, there was very little focus on agriculture in terms of application of technology. It's grown from $400 million in 2010 to about $3.6 billion in 2016-17, and then there was a bit of a dip in 2016, and then it's gone back up again, so it's on the rise. This is the first time that this has happened. So, again, what is Agtech? What's the definition? What are we dealing with here? And one definition, which was put out by the US Study Centre in their recent report into Agtech in Australia, was that it's a nascent industry at the intersection of agriculture and technology that can include pre- and post-farm gate. And yes, that's true. That's in the application, that's true. But I keep coming back to the fact that it's an investment category. That's what's driven this. And it came about when the venture capital and tech startup world suddenly switched on to the idea that there was an agriculture sector out there that they could move into. And it was really triggered by the investment by Monsanto into Climate Corp for $1 billion in 2015. That's what got the ball rolling and got the conversation started. But there's a few myths that are in that. Because you've got a whole new technology and investment sector coming into agriculture, which they know not much about, there's a few myths that are perpetuating this. And one of these is a report that was published in 2015 by McKinsey, which was called The Digital America, A Tale of the Haves and Have-Mores. And they did a big study of all industry, and they ranked them in terms of which ones were the most digitised. And this is one of the narratives that's floating around in the agtech world, and every time I see it, it just annoys me because it's not true, which is that agriculture is, lumped in with hunting, is the least digitised industry across all of them. It's just not true. I'm sorry, it's just not true. If you dig into the methodology, one of the ways that they did it was to count how many desktop laptops there were within the businesses in these sectors. So if you go to any kind of cropping farmer or any kind of farmer really in Australia, you're not going to find too many desktop and laptops, but go out the back gate and you'll find a $500,000 machine which is full of computers. Okay, so there was a few methodological issues in that survey. So let's follow the money and let's find out really, where is the technology, the digital technology in agriculture. So our ag innovation system in Australia is currently worth around $3 billion. That's what we spend in R&D in the ag sector. And about $675 million of this is through the RDCs, through the Rural Development Corporations. And half of that is Australia's only real form of agricultural subsidy, which is government funding which matches grower levies. And the other component of it is obviously funding that's coming in through the private sector, through the universities, through SARA, etc., through the ARC system and CRC grants. So if that's what we have today, then what is AgTech? How does AgTech come and sit alongside that and integrate with that? So the AgTech sector in Australia is 2 years old. It's in its infancy. It's still tiny. but it's growing rapidly. So in September 2016, SproutX was launched. SproutX is a joint venture between Findex and the National Farmers Federation. It was the first dedicated Agtech accelerator in Australia. And since then, they've had 2 cohorts run through. So we've got about 18, 19 startups that have been funded through that program. And since then, we've had an explosion. So we've got incubators and accelerator programs across the country being funded by state governments, being hosted and funded by universities, by private organisations, by international funders and so forth. But still it's in its infancy. So this product from the US Studies, this report from the US Study Centre went through and worked out how much investment had been made in Agtech over the last couple of years. And in this last year, it was $3 million. So we are small fry compared to what's going on internationally. So we've got David and Goliath really happening here. And together, these 2 components form what our innovation system is going forward. So if we think of Goliath as the existing innovation system, using the RD&E spend as a proxy, and we think of the Agtech system, which is David, and using investment as a proxy, we can start to look at these 2 components through a series of prisms. The first one is obviously the size. So by my calculation, the Agtech sector is worth about 0.1% of the existing spend in R&D. So what are the outcomes that they're looking for? So the existing Agtech innovation system is looking for industry growth, and there's a strong public good component to that. And I think we've lost sight of that. And I think we really need to be careful not to lose sight of that there is a public good. And if you think about it, when it was set up 30 years ago, the RDC system was set up to be a small form of government subsidy, if you want to call it that, which was the best way to direct government funding into research and development, which would underpin the growth of our agriculture sector. And it's worked extremely well. We've had 2 to 3% plus or minus, giving and taking drought and so forth, growth year on year over that time. So it has worked well. The Agtech sector, on the other hand, is commercially driven, and they're looking for a return on investment. And that drives into scale. So when you look at the existing ag innovation sector, it's unashamedly focused on Australia. It's Australian taxpayer dollars, it's Australian research dollars, it's Australian farmer and producer dollars that's producing good and outcomes for Australia. The Agtech sector, by its very nature, has to be global. When you come in as a startup, you cannot come in looking at what's the market in the paddock next door. You have to be looking at what are the global markets. That's the only way that an investor is going to come in and invest in your startup to give you, because you've identified where it can scale to in the world. And then who benefits? So from our existing system, Australian growers obviously do, and there's a strong national interest in that. From the Agtech sector perspective, your customers are obviously benefiting, but your investors are benefiting as well. So I think we need to start untangling these things and understanding what's driving 2 of them. And we have a chasm between these 2 worlds. We have a chasm between the largely urban-based Agtech sector and what I call the rural innovation ecosystem. So this is the rural innovation ecosystem. It's made up of our RDCs, of farmer groups, of people that are getting together, trying technology, of small business and medium enterprises that are out there supporting, supplying, maintaining and delivering technology to farmers. And then we've got the urban Agtech sector, as I've already articulated. These 2 worlds are colliding. And the Agtech sector, and you've talked about data analysis and big data and so forth, and there's a cautionary tale to be spent here, because the Agtech sector and the emerging innovation sector wants lots of big farm data. We all think that there's something to be gained there. But farmers are instinctively uneasy about that. And this is what the P2D program report actually identified and put some numbers on, that despite a general willingness to share data, farmers need reassurance to address concerns about how the aggregated data will be governed and used. The majority of respondents reported great concerns over aggregated data in relation to privacy, financial advantage taken by other businesses, and the potential for it to be used to influence the markets such as produce prices and land value. So we've got to get through those concerns, because that concern is starting to create a barrier to the flow of data. We have to work through that. Connectivity is an issue. Everyone talks about the data drought in rural areas, but it's going to be solved within 5 years. It gets solved not just by the NBN and Telstra and mobile networks and 5G, but the real end game here is in space technology. So we've got 2 startups in Adelaide, Fleet, is designing and launching shoebox-sized low orbiting satellites. They've put 2 up this year and they'll continue to throw those up in the air. Myriota has designed, it's a startup out of technology out of UniSA, and they have the ground station which connects to an existing low orbiting satellite network. So basically across any part of Australia in the outback, we've suddenly got connectivity happening at different scales and at different costs. It's not going to be a problem. We don't know what we don't know. So I took this photo yesterday when I was flying from Sydney to Adelaide, and I looked down and there it was. And I think this is the chasm. This is articulation of the chasm, really, that we've got urban-based governments, tech providers and researchers and so forth, and then we've got our rural innovation ecosystem, and there's huge geographic spaces in between. But this photo really, I leaned out the window and I caught it because in one photo you've got an indication of what's going on. So these circles here have a pivot, an irrigation pivot at the centre of them, and those pivots, undoubtedly there's soil moisture sensing technology there, there's actuators that are switching on and off based on sensing data that's coming through. Irrigation is fully digitised in this country already. Up here, these little ones up the top here, these little are probably, I'd imagine they're chicken production systems. And again, there's a whole lot of sensing and digital technology that's going into those systems. And then over here, I imagine that could be a solar array. So just looking out the window and knowing what to look for and to see, there it is, digital agriculture in our landscapes already happening. So what's the role for government in all of this? Well, I think partly the role for government is to be able to see that picture and know what it is and know what's actually going on out there. So every state government at the moment has an Agtech program, has an Agtech strategy or a digital agriculture strategy, and they vary from state to state. But I would caution governments to be prescriptive in what they think needs to happen out there in terms of infrastructure. Because the reality is that infrastructure is already out there, it's being invested in, and what governments need to do is to be focusing on how can we enable the bringing together of these two worlds so that we've got an integrated Agtech community, which brings in our existing rural innovation ecosystem and leverages this new Agtech capital that's coming in. How am I going for time? 1, 2, 5 more minutes. So what does that look like then? Where can we start to focus these resources? Well, we need digital literacy across our agriculture sector. So there's training, there's education, there's making sure that certainly the younger generation of farmers are coming through, they've already got it, but we still need to be supporting those who are sort of at the other end of the scale. We need standards for farm data interoperability, which takes into consideration farmers' oversight over usage rights of their data. That's really important. The P2D studies told us that clearly, that they're concerned about their data flowing past their farm gate and into upstream aggregated data sets. We need to be encouraging entrepreneurs to come from our farming community and our farm advisor community. So can we get startup thinking into those sectors so that we get from the ground up grassroots innovation happening? It's already out there. What it also needs is education in investor readiness. So we've got fantastic small and medium enterprises that have been in that digital rural innovation ecosystem for 20, 30 years. Family businesses. They've got amazing technology. They're doing fantastic development. They can't get capital. Even though there's capital flowing in, they can't get to it because they don't know how to make themselves investor ready. They don't know how to choose from all these array of capital options that are out there. How do they choose an investment partner? They don't have the skills to actually get themselves to that next level and to bring that money in. We need to respond positively to these issues of trust, privacy and security. And we need to connect the R better with the new innovation system for D and E, so the research with development and extension. And that's the space where my consulting business sits squarely. I'm really about bringing together the research community with the Agtech community to get application of science and research out there. So where's it all going? There's so many opportunities. It's so exciting, but there's a word of caution. We are on the hype curve. There's a huge amount of hype out there, and things that look really, really big and exciting, in actual fact, might not be quite so big, and we've got a long way to go. So there's a long game here. I'm excited to be at the grassroots, at the starting point of the Agtech sector, because I can see that in 10 and 15 years' time, I'll look back and see where we started. And so that's the kind of timescales that we need to be thinking about these things over. And what does it all mean? Well, there's never been a better time to be in agriculture, a more exciting time to be in agriculture. And the National Farmers Federation launched our 2030 vision, which is to grow agriculture in Australia from a $60 billion a year industry to a $100 billion a year industry. And we've got the Prime Minister behind us. We have bipartisan support for that at the federal level. And it's a great time to be involved in agriculture. So that's it. If there are any questions?